I was 77 years old the morning I stepped outside in my slippers and found what was left of my life reduced to a circle of raw wood, 18 inches across, pale, exposed, drying already at the edges under an October sky that had no business looking so calm. Where the magnolia had been, not a tree anymore, a stump. I stood there longer than I can measure, not frozen, not shocked in the way people describe shock. It was something quieter than that, something exact. The kind of stillness that comes when your mind begins taking inventory before your heart has caught up. Behind me, men were working, efficient, professional, loading brush into a truck in the alley like they had done this 100 times before, which I suppose they had. And my son, Derek, stood near the barrage, new work gloves, clean, uncreased, looking pleased with himself. I didn't speak to him. I turned around, went back inside, put water on the kettle, and called my attorney. If you've never watched something grow for 40 years, you might think this is about a tree. It isn't. So let me tell you what was there before it was taken, because loss only has weight when you understand what existed. I taught botany for 31 years, not general biology, not broad science, botany, structure, growth, root systems, cambium layers, dormancy cycles, the quiet mechanics of how something lives. I spent decades teaching students that growth is never accidental, and for over 40 years I practiced that lesson in my own backyard. The garden behind my house wasn't decorative, it was deliberate. Every tree, every planting, every inch of soil had been chosen, studied, and tended with intention. My neighbor, Noonie Darden, has lived next door for 31 years. She calls it the most deliberate half-acre in DeKalb County. She's right. The magnolia stood in the southeast corner. Magnolia ex Solangiana, if you want the proper name. My husband Warren planted it the year our daughter Renee was born. He brought it home wrapped in a damp towel like something fragile and hopeful. He wasn't a gardener, not even close. He was an electrician, smelled of soda, read Louis L'Amour paperbacks, called everything I grew the green things. But that spring he said he wanted to plant something that would still be here when our daughter was grown. We put it in the ground together. He held the root ball while I filled the soil. We watered it slowly. 4 years later it bloomed. 7 pale blossoms, white fading into pink at the edges. Warren stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and said, "Well, I guess it worked." That was all, and it was perfect. The magnolia and my daughter grew up together. Same seasons, same yard, same sky. Every March for 41 years that tree bloomed for exactly 10 days. Not 9, not 11, 10, reliable as the calendar. I stood there at that window every single year and watched it happen, even after Warren died, especially after Warren died. The rest of the garden, it wasn't random, nothing in it was random. The river birches along the east fence, I propagated those myself from cuttings in 1994, 3 years before they were strong enough to survive on their own. I watered them every other morning through a drought summer, dragging a hose before sunrise just to keep them alive. By last October, they were 40 feet tall. I knew their height not because I guessed, but because I had measured. That's what a botanist does. We pay attention. The persimmon tree, Diasporos virginiana, native, stubborn, slow. It takes patience most people don't have. I planted it in 1998, waited 11 years for fruit, 11, and when it finally produced, it did so quietly, without ceremony, like it had been working the entire time beneath the soil where no one could see it. By the time Derek's crew cut it down, it was at peak production. It would have given another 20 years, at least. And the crepe myrtles along the fence, 6 of them, planted bare root in 2003. They had just begun showing their mature bark, the kind that takes over 15 years to develop, that soft, peeling texture like paper. I used to cut branches every July and bring them inside. They didn't smell like much, which I always appreciated. Not everything needs to announce itself. This is what was there. 40 years of time, measured growth, deliberate care, patience layered season over season until it became something that couldn't be rushed, replaced, or recreated. So when I stood there that morning, looking at the stump, I wasn't just grieving, I was calculating, the way I used to grade papers, line by line, item by item, accurate, unforgiving. Derek had been back in Atlanta for 18 months, 49 years old, divorced, working a steady job, trying in the way some people try, close enough to look like effort, but not close enough to land correctly. Sunday dinners started again. He'd bring pies I didn't like, forget details I had already told him, miss things that mattered. But I told myself, this is what rebuilding looks like. The first request came 6 weeks in, $900, car repair, temporary. I wrote the check, didn't ask for paperwork. He was my son. Then 18,000, a new car. Same tone, same promise. I'll pay you back. I wrote that check too, but this time I wrote something else in my ledger. No promissory note. 4 words, small, accurate, and louder than anything I said out loud. After that, it didn't happen all at once. That's the important part. Nothing like this ever does. It happened slowly. Grocery charges I didn't make, storage bins in my garage, oil changes I paid for, keys used without asking, spaces taken over quietly, like roots spreading underground, invisible, until, suddenly, they're everywhere. By September, I'd done the math. Nearly $20,000, no repayment, no mention of repayment, and something else, a shift, subtle but undeniable. Derek sat on my porch one afternoon and said, "You know, Mom, this garden must be a lot for you at your age." That was the first time he said it out loud. Not concern, really, an argument, the beginning of one. And then October came, and I woke up to sky where my trees had been. He said he did it to help me, said it made things easier, more light, less work, room for parking. Gina's idea. I stood there next to that stump in my slippers, and I understood something with complete clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't thoughtlessness. It wasn't even cruelty. It was something far more precise. It was a pattern, and I had finally finished adding it up. I went inside, made my coffee, sat down, and waited until it was cold. Then I made another cup and started making calls. I didn't raise my voice that morning. I didn't argue. I didn't ask him why. Because by the time I was standing in my kitchen with a second cup of coffee going cold in my hands, there was no question left to ask. I had already done the math. Not that morning, not suddenly. I had been doing it for months, quietly, carefully, accurately. The ledger was in the top drawer of my desk, green cloth cover, edges worn smooth from years of use. I have kept one like it since Warren died. A teacher on a pension learns quickly that memory is not a reliable accounting system, so you write things down, not because you don't trust people, but because you trust numbers. I took it out and opened it to October. October 14th. Derek, car repair, $900. The ink had settled into the paper slightly over time, but the line was still sharp, clear, undeniable. November. Derek, car purchase, $18,000, and beneath it, in my own handwriting, smaller than usual, no promissory note. At the time, that line had felt like a comment, a reminder, a small correction I intended to make later. But sitting there that morning, it read like something else, like a warning I had written to myself and then ignored. I turned the page. April. Unexplained grocery charges, $75.72. 2 entries. Precise. Documented. Unaddressed. Then January through July. Storage unit, $67 per month. 7 months, $469. March. Oil change, $340. I had offered to pay for that one. That part mattered, because not everything had been taken. Some things I had given. That's the part people like to overlook, the part where you participated, where every individual decision made sense in isolation, small enough, reasonable enough, temporary enough. I added the column again, not because I didn't know the total, but because I wanted to feel it arrive. $19,784.72. I sat there for a long time looking at that number, not shocked, not angry, just tired. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much, but from slowly being redirected away from your own life without noticing it. One small adjustment at a time, one quiet compromise at a time, until suddenly you look up and realize you've been living around someone else's needs. Every line in that ledger was a moment, a choice. I had written the check. I had stayed quiet. I had made space, and I had called it helping. I closed the ledger, slowly, deliberately, and I sat there with both hands resting on the cover like I was holding something that had finally told the truth. The thing about patterns is that they don't announce themselves. They accumulate, quietly, until the total becomes too large to ignore. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. By September, I had already begun to understand, not fully, not cleanly, but enough. There are things you learn in botany that stay with you long after you leave the classroom. One of them is this: not everything that is struggling can be saved. Students don't like that lesson. They want effort to equal outcome.
They want care to guarantee survival, but roots don't work that way. A root system that has gone anaerobic will not recover just because you improve the soil. The damage has already occurred at the cellular level, invisible at first, irreversible eventually. You can water it perfectly, you can adjust the light, you can give it everything it should have had in the beginning. It will still not be what it was. I had taught that for 31 years, clearly, confidently, without hesitation, and I had spent the last 18 months refusing to apply it to my own life, because this wasn't a plant, this was my son. Derek had not been cruel, that's what made it harder. If he had shouted, if he had demanded, if he had taken with obvious intent, I would have recognized it immediately, named it, stopped it. But that isn't what he did. He asked, politely, reasonably, always with just enough justification to make refusal feel unnecessary. And when I gave, he accepted, without question, without pause. And then he asked again, not maliciously, not strategically, systematically. There is a difference, and it matters, because a person who takes deliberately knows what they are doing, but a person who convinces themselves that taking is helping will do it indefinitely, and they will sleep well at night. That was Derek. He had arranged his thinking in such a way that his convenience and my well-being always appeared to align, and because he believed it, he never had to examine it. That afternoon on the porch in August, when he said the garden was a lot for me, that wasn't concern, it was groundwork, a sentence placed carefully into the future, something to return to later, something to build on. I heard it when he said it, I just didn't respond to it, because naming things makes them real, and I wasn't ready yet, but I was closer than I had ever been. By the time September ended, I understood something clearly enough to say it to myself without softening it. Some things don't grow back, not the way they were, not in the same time, not in the same life. That is not bitterness, that is science, and once you see something accurately, you have a responsibility to treat it accurately, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. I remember standing in the garden that last week of September, early morning, before the light had fully settled. The persimmon fruit was beginning to turn, the crepe myrtles were finishing their bloom. The magnolia stood exactly as it had always had, whole, unchanged, reliable, and I remember thinking, without knowing why the thought had come when it did, that I had been looking at it for the last time. Some realizations arrive quietly like that. They don't announce themselves. They don't explain. They just sit with you, waiting for the moment when everything else catches up. That moment came 2 weeks later, at 6 in the morning, in my slippers, standing in a yard that no longer existed, and by then there was nothing left to misunderstand.
Derek called on Friday afternoon. Not that morning, not the day before. 2 days. It took 2 days for the paperwork to reach him, and one more for him to decide how to speak. I could hear it the moment he said hello. That careful tone, measured, practiced. He had spoken to someone, a friend, a lawyer, someone who had told him to stay calm, to not escalate, to sound reasonable. "Mum," he said, "I got something in the mail,
and I just want to understand what I did to deserve this. Deserve. That was the word he chose. I sat at the kitchen table while he spoke, the same table where I had balanced my checkbook for decades, the same place where I had added that column. Deserve turns a decision into a punishment. It assumes there has been something taken from you unfairly. But I had not taken anything from Derek. I had simply stopped giving. You knew what those trees were. There was a pause. Not long, just enough for him to understand I was not going to move away from it. "Mum, they were trees," he said. "I mean, yeah, they were nice, but this is different. This is everything." Everything. I looked out the window as he spoke. The yard was still open, too open, the kind of space that doesn't feel like freedom, it feels like absence. "You used my key," I said, calm, clear. "You brought a crew onto my property while I was not home." "I was trying to help," he said quickly. "I know," I said, and I did. That was the problem. "You hired men to cut down a tree your father planted. You cut down trees I have tended for 40 years. You made that decision without asking me." Silence. Longer this time. "Gina thought," he started. "This is not about Gina." He stopped. There's a moment in conversations like this where the other person realizes the usual paths are closed. No deflection, no softening, no redirection, just the thing itself. "You said it was for me," I said. "It was," he insisted. "Mum, look at it now. You've got light, you've got space. It's easier. You don't have to keep up with all that work anymore." I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of frustration, out of recognition. This was the pattern, fully visible now. He wasn't lying. That's what made it complete. Derek had built an entire structure in his mind where this made sense, where removing something I loved was improving my life. And because he believed it, he never questioned it. "Derek," I said, "you have borrowed close to £20,000 from me." He exhaled. A shift. He hadn't expected that turn. "I told you I'd pay you back," he said quickly. "I've just had a lot going on. The move, the divorce, getting settled." "Yes," I said, "you've had a lot going on." I let the silence sit there, not sharp, not aggressive, just present. "Derek," I said, "you have used my car. You charged my grocery account. You stored your belongings in my garage." Each sentence placed carefully, like entries in a ledger. "I thought we were helping each other," he said, and there it was. Not manipulation, not strategy, belief. "That's what you think this is," I said. Another pause. "Isn't it?" he asked. I looked down at my hands, steady, calm. "No," I said. The word landed cleanly. No emphasis, no anger, just accuracy. "I have been helping you," I continued. "You have been taking what was available to you and calling it help." He didn't respond immediately, because there isn't a quick answer to that. "Mum," he said finally, quieter now, "I didn't mean for it to come out like that." "I know," I said, and I did. That was the hardest part to hold. If he had meant harm, this would have been simpler. But he hadn't. He had simply arranged things so that his needs always came first, without ever saying so. "I thought," he began again, slower now, "Gina and I have been talking about being around more, helping more, being here for you." I almost smiled, not out of amusement, out of clarity. By removing the things I built, I asked. He didn't answer. By making decisions about my home without asking me. Silence. By deciding what is easier for me without asking what I want. Nothing. The silence wasn't resistance anymore. It was recognition. Dad would have hated this, he said suddenly. There it was, the last place people go when they're trying to anchor themselves. I thought about Warren, his chair, his quiet way of seeing things. You're right, I said. He would have. That landed, not as agreement, as truth. I'm sorry, Derek said. The tone had changed now, less controlled, more real. I didn't think it would be this big of a deal, he added. And there it was again. Not cruelty, distance, the inability to measure something he had never valued the same way. I know, I said, because I did, and that knowledge didn't soften anything. It clarified it. I didn't know it meant that much to you, he said. I looked out at the yard again, at the empty space where the magnolia had stood. You knew, I said quietly. You just didn't understand. There's a difference. Knowing is information. Understanding is weight. He had the first. He did not have the second. I can fix it, he said quickly. We can plant something new. We can... No, I said. That word again. Clean, final. You cannot replace 40 years. You cannot replace your father. You cannot replace what you removed. Silence, and this time it stayed. I am sorry, he said again, and this time it was real, but it was also too late, not in a dramatic sense, not as punishment, just in the way that certain things, once done, cannot be undone. I know you are, I said, and I meant that too. That's the thing about clarity. It doesn't require anger. It doesn't even require distance. It just requires you to stop pretending something is what it isn't. We sat in silence for a few seconds. Then he asked quietly, So that's it. I thought about the question, carefully, because it wasn't what he thought it was. This wasn't about inheritance. It wasn't about money. It was about recognition, and I had already reached it. Yes, I said, not harsh, not cold, just finished.
The house was quiet after that call. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, the kind that feels settled. There were no raised voices echoing in the walls, no slammed doors, no unfinished sentences hanging in the air, just stillness. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after I hung up, the phone where I had placed it, face down, unmoving. There is a particular clarity that comes after something ends cleanly, not dramatically, not loudly, just accurately. I had expected to feel something sharper, anger perhaps, or grief that demanded attention, but what I felt instead was something I recognized from a different part of my life, the end of a school year. 31 years of teaching gives you a sense for that moment. The final grades submitted, the papers filed, everything accounted for, nothing left to revise. Not relief, not celebration, completion. I stood up from the table and carried my coffee to the sink. It had gone cold again. I rinsed the mug, set it in the rack. Routine has a way of reasserting itself when everything else shifts. Outside, the yard was still too open. The light fell differently now, uninterrupted, unfiltered. It was not better, it was simply different. I stepped out onto the back porch. Warren's chair was still there,
green wood, slightly worn at the arms where his hands had rested for years. It faced the southeast corner. There was nothing there now worth facing. I stood beside it for a moment, not sitting, just standing, and then I turned it. It wasn't a large movement, just a few inches across the boards, but it changed the direction completely. Now it faced the garden gate, a different view, a different orientation. Sometimes that's all a decision is, not rebuilding everything, just turning the chair. The paperwork had already been filed. Sylvia does not delay. The will revision, the deed modification, clean, documented, permanent. Derek's name removed, not as punishment, as correction. I thought about that word for a while. Correction. It implies something was wrong, not malicious, not intentional, just misaligned. And once you see a misalignment clearly, you either adjust it or you continue living with it. I had adjusted it. The calls stopped, not abruptly, not announced. They simply became less frequent, then infrequent, then occasional, the way water settles when the pressure is gone. Sunday dinners ended the same way. No conversation, no decision, just no arrival. I cooked for one again. It wasn't a loss, not in the way it might have been before, because what I had lost was not the presence, it was the assumption behind it. There is a difference. The garage remained unchanged for 3 weeks, 6 plastic bins stacked against the wall, labels facing outward, Derek's things. I did not move them, I did not reorganize around them, I simply left them where they were. One Wednesday afternoon, while I was at the botanical garden, he came and took them. I knew because when I returned, the space was clear, and everything else was exactly where I had left it. The shelves, the tools, the pruners hanging in their order. He had not disturbed anything. He was capable of that. I noted it, accurately, not as redemption, just information. Noonie came on Friday, as she said she would, 2 jars of fig preserves in a paper bag. She didn't ask questions, didn't fill the air with unnecessary words. She sat with me on the porch for 2 hours. We spoke when there was something to say, and we were quiet when there wasn't. That is what 30 years of friendship looks like. At one point, she looked toward the back garden, just once. "The persimmons sending up suckers," she said. "I saw," I replied. "You could let one grow. Maybe." And I meant maybe, not yes, not no, because not everything needs to be decided immediately. Renee came the following weekend. She walked through the backyard slowly, taking in the space, the absence. She didn't comment on it directly. She didn't need to. Some things are understood without language. We raked leaves on Saturday morning. There were fewer. Without the magnolia, without the birches, the pile was smaller, quieter. Loss does that. It reduces things in ways you don't immediately notice until you do. On Saturday afternoon, we moved the chair, Warren's chair, from the southeast corner to the other side of the porch, near the garden gate. It had been facing that corner for 9 years, since he died. There was nothing there now, reason to keep looking in that direction. "Better," Renee said. "Yes," I replied, and I meant it. On Sunday morning before she left, she asked me something carefully. "Do you miss him?" I took my time answering because the question deserved accuracy. "I miss what I believed was there," I said. She nodded. "That's different," she said. "Yes," I replied. "It is." After she left, the house returned to its usual quiet, not empty, just mine. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time since October, I allowed myself to think forward. not about what had been taken, but about what remained and what could still be placed. The yard was open now, not by my choosing, but open nonetheless, and space, even when created by loss, is still space. The question is what you do with it. I stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the light. It was different, but it was mine, and that made all the difference.
The yard didn't heal. It adjusted. There is a difference. Winter came early that year. Not dramatic, just steady. The kind of cold that settles into soil and makes everything honest. I walked the garden less at first, not because I avoided it, because I was listening to it differently now. The space where the magnolia had stood was no longer absence, it was measurement. You don't lose a 50-year tree quietly. Even after it's gone, the ground remembers. The stump remained for a while, pale, still visible, like a sentence that had not been fully erased. I left it longer than I expected to, not out of hesitation, out of observation, because removal is not the same as understanding, and I wanted to understand what remained. The persimmon suckers continued to grow, small, persistent, unsure of their shape, but certain of their direction. I didn't rush them. Some things reveal themselves only when you stop demanding speed. Renee called every Sunday. She never asked the same questions twice. She never needed to. We talked about ordinary things, food, weather, work, and beneath all of it, something steadier had settled. Not repair, not return, alignment. Derek did not call often. When he did, the conversations were shorter, careful, measured, as if both of us were now aware of edges that had always been there, but never named. There was no apology that could restore trees, and I no longer expected one. Spring arrived quietly, as it always does when it is not being watched for proof. The yard looked different in morning light, not empty, not full, just correctly proportioned for what it now contained. I stood at the kitchen window again in March, coffee in hand, routine unchanged, and I realized something I had not said aloud before. The magnolia had not been my only memory in that yard. It had been my longest agreement with time, and that agreement had ended. Not broken, ended. I went to the nursery that Saturday. Cherokee native plants. Same road, same air, same quiet of soil and growth. Ramona nodded when she saw me. She didn't ask what I wanted first. She already knew I had decided. There were young trees again, smaller than memory, lighter than history, but not lesser. I chose slowly, not emotionally, practically, as I always had. One sapling stood slightly apart from the rest, 3 years old, straight, uncertain but balanced. Magnolia again, not the same one, not the same time, but the same language of growth. I paid for it without ceremony, loaded it carefully into the car, and drove home. The northwest corner was already occupied by new intention, so I chose a different place, not to replace, to continue. The planting took time, soil prepared properly, depth measured, water given slowly, no rushing, no symbolism spoken aloud, just work. When it was done, I stood up and looked at it, small, present, alive, and I understood something simple.
Nothing important in a garden is ever immediate. It always begins smaller than expectation and grows beyond it later. Inside the house, the kettle clicked off. I poured coffee, sat at the table, looked out the window. The yard was not what it had been, and that was no longer a problem to solve. It was a condition to live with. Some things don't grow back, that remains true. But not everything that ends is meant to be restored. Some things are meant to be replaced by something that has its own beginning. Outside, the new sapling stood in the morning light, small, uncertain, entirely alive, and for the first time in a long time, I did not measure what was missing, I measured what was here, and that was enough.